Hello, welcome back to Talking Planning. So with Australia slowly but surely starting to ease border restrictions and a big change in terms of the border controls with coronavirus, I think slowly but surely we're going to see a return to domestic air travel in Australia over the next few months. So this is great for a lot of people. With the exception of Victoria, just about every state is now at the point where we can actually fairly safely open borders with a likely low risk of community transmission developing. This is important because most Australians, because of our long distances, travel by air to travel between cities. Good example is if you're going between Brisbane and Sydney, it's a 14, maybe 15-hour train journey, between 11 and 12 hours by car, and it's a 1.5-hour flight, so it makes a huge difference to travel times. Another important thing is aviation makes sure that our regions get the critical supplies that they need, and it ensures that people can get in and out of the regions as they're needed for medical purposes with the Royal Flying Doctor Service, as well as commercial travel, which brings freight as well as passengers to the regions. Unfortunately, COVID-19's been a massive disruption to the aviation industry, with the vast majority of airports experiencing passenger drops of 90% or perhaps even more in some cases. Now, I need to be clear that these restrictions were a necessary step and have contributed to Australia's general success in terms of managing COVID-19. So I think it would be naive to say that we shouldn't have had these restrictions, but they've hurt hard. So I think the majority of us, particularly from an aviation and planning perspective, are looking forward to seeing the easing of restrictions so that we can see a return to a new normal and we can see that growth and restart of the economy as well. Now, fortunately for Australia, because we're getting over probably the worst of the first wave of the virus in most cases, excluding Victoria, we're now seeing that rebound in domestic travel, and we're slowly but surely seeing more and more travel options open up. I'm hoping to do a little bit of travel in the future, and I actually have something booked in a few weeks' time as a local little trip around Queensland, which I'm really looking forward to. I should point out international travel is certainly still off the cards for a while, but I suppose now is also a really great time to explore your own state and explore your own country as well. So in the meantime, I'd like to share with you experiences from a few of my favourite flights. One of the big things that I wouldn't necessarily say just pride myself on, but I'm happy to say is a lot of these experiences are things that you can go out and do with just a little bit of planning. I've never flown first class. I haven't got some major sponsored review of flying the Residents with Etihad, though let's be real, I'd love to do it one day. And I don't even have a credit card for earning points. It's just sort of something that you can do honestly as a casual geek like me who's got a normal life to live. So let's get started. The first flight I just had to mention, and I have to put it on the list. And that is certainly as a domestic traveller in Australia, getting the chance to fly on the Qantas 747. Now, I know lots of friends who've been on it plenty of times, and there's probably been thousands and thousands of reviews of flights on board that aircraft, but I had to add it in. I've only done one 747 flight, and it was only 1 hour last year in November from Sydney to Brisbane. Now, in terms of my actual experience, I got a lot of the odds stacked against me, but I still absolutely loved it. I had a middle seat, all the windows were booked out really quickly, and I was actually sitting next to someone who didn't realise it was a special flight. They had no clue that it was a specific service that had been put on to let people experience the 747 domestically. Despite that, it was an absolutely fantastic flight. Although we had a little bit of turbulence because it was in early November when the bushfires were starting to get really bad, so there was a lot of turbulent air, but that couldn't, put off such an incredible experience. And I think it's going to be really, really sad to see the 747 leave our skies. Apparently, I've heard a little rumour that there is going to be a few little 1 hour flights in the next couple of weeks in a few different cities. But until I hear any words from Qantas on that, I wouldn't hold your breath. So let's move on to the second flight that I want to tell you about. And this one is a business class flight. I had a great opportunity in March last year as a 21st birthday present to myself to travel over to Perth and with a little bit of creative booking, I managed to score myself a lie-flat business class seat on board the A330 for approximately a 5-hour flight over. There was an absolutely excellent menu of lots of good stuff to enjoy, and a pretty nice wine list too. So if you ever get the chance, it's worth it, I think. It's a nice little celebration, but you just got to keep in mind that it can get quite pricey, so definitely hunt around and definitely consider the bid to upgrade option. Now, the third experience I want to talk about is a flight I did in 2018 with JetGo, who unfortunately went into administration and then no bidder was found and the airline was dissolved in mid-2018. So I got to fly from Townsville to Rockhampton and through to the Gold Coast with JetGo on an E140. Now I should point out, Townsville, for me, is probably not Australia's best city, so getting to the airport regardless is nice. But I had something extra to look forward to in the fact that I was flying on an E140. It's quite a quaint experience. You're on a little 1- and 2-seat regional jet, and, you know, I got seat 1A, so I had loads of leg room and I had a great chance to actually chat with the crew and find out a little bit more about the company, which was really refreshing and interesting. It was a real shame that the business didn't last, and otherwise I would have loved to have flown JetGo a few more times. They're a good little airline with an interesting product, something very unique for Australia. The fourth flight is a Alliance flight on a Fokker 100 from Brisbane to Newcastle. So this is one of my most recent flights. I did a quick trip just before COVID-19 became a real talking point in March. I flew in late February with Alliance down to Newcastle. I flew on the Fokker 100, and there's actually a short bit of a review on that in my City Review of Newcastle clip, which you can check out there. Australia is one of the few countries where the Fokker 100 actually still operates, and we have lots of them. So if you're an av geek, particularly in Australia, go and make the most of it. It's a really cool experience. It's a very unique plane, certainly in a world where travel is dominated by the 737 and A320. A Fokker 100 is still a pretty neat plane to go and fly on. They've got a real nostalgia to them. You know, big, old school, comfy seats, like you'd remember as a kid on a 737 Classic. The old square buttons with funny logos and designs that you just don't expect to see now. It's a nice blast from the past, and I'd recommend it if you get the chance. Number 5, I'm going to talk about, it's quite a special little flight. I got to fly with Charter Airline Heavy Lift on their ATR 42-300 up to Gladstone. And I actually got invited on that flight by a family friend. It was a CASA certification flight. They needed to get people on board the flight so that they could actually have some passengers for training and certification purposes. And they were looking for people, and because I knew a couple of people there, I got the invite. It was a really cool opportunity, and it was interesting for 2 reasons. One, it's not every day you get to fly on a 1990 built ATR. It's also not every day you get a handwritten boarding pass, which is pretty darn cool. I'm never say I've actually had one of these outside of that trip, and I've done flights since, oh gosh, 2000 as a kid, when I was 2, with flying with Ansett. But yeah, much like the Fokkers, they've got a really nostalgic cabin, old vinyl seats, the unusual square buttons, and it's just another blast from the past and a design from a different era. And I think in aviation, it's something that we don't always get to see. So when you get the opportunity to fly on an older or more unusual aircraft, you just take it, and it's fantastic to do. It's just not something you can do all the time, but when you get the opportunity, go for it. And number 6 also brings me onto an aircraft which is sadly no longer operating, and that was another Virgin Australia aircraft. So back in late 2017, I actually took my very first business class flight ever from Sydney to Brisbane, and normally that flight's another 737, usually an 800, occasionally a 700, but this was actually a E190 flight from Sydney to Brisbane. Now, I've always liked the E190, I should put that out there, but getting to fly that from Sydney to Brisbane and getting to fly in a regional business class was actually really quite cool. And those aircraft, whilst they lived a good life in Virgin Australia, they've moved on now. And I know Stobart Air actually bought some for a little while to operate on charters in Europe. And a few of the big YouTubers have done some good reviews of that British Airways secret business class product. And you can go and, I'll leave a link in the description so you can go and check it out and see the product for yourself. I should point out a lot of these flights were before I really started looking at really filming any flights and journeys, and I just took the odd sneaky pic out the window and whilst walking across the jet bridge. But no, there's some really cool products, and I'd highly recommend checking that out just so you can see the difference, particularly if you're used to European business classes. I also actually had seat 1F on that flight, which made it all the more special. And there's always a magic to sitting in row 1 on a flight, I think. Now, number 7 is also from the same trip when I actually went down to Newcastle. After that, I actually had to go to a job interview in Sydney, and something just worked out just right and I managed to make it work. I had a job interview in the afternoon on a Tuesday, and I had to get from Newcastle to Sydney on the Tuesday morning. Now, the average conscious person is going to hire a car or more likely take the train. I did neither of those, and I managed to fly with Pelican. So I got on a bus out to Newcastle Airport, and I flew from Newcastle to Sydney on a Jetstream 32, which is a little 19-seat aircraft, and it's a cool experience. So in terms of value for money, I can't recommend that flight. But as an opportunity to do a low-pass flight over Sydney Harbour on a commercial service, you don't have many choices, and I think that's a pretty damn good option. Plus, you get to fly on a unique aircraft that you don't get to do all the time either. Number 8 is another regional jet. Of course. So I flew from Brisbane to Canberra with Qantas on their Boeing 717. The 717, when it was new, was not really a strong selling plane. But over time, it's actually gained a reputation with airlines for being really solid, dependable, and used. They're highly sought after, and just about every airline that operates them now wants more but can't get them. So Qantas bought a bunch for their Qantas Link division, and they're used quite frequently on regional flights throughout Australia. And it's the size of the aircraft as well as the toughness that really sets them apart from the competition. They fill a nice gap between the 737 and A320 and between turboprops, but also they're a well-proven aircraft, which makes them quite suitable for our regional airfields. Overall, the 717 is quite a cool aircraft to fly on, 2-3 seating, reasonable sized seats, but most of them have been modernised now and they feel very much like a current design of aircraft. So they don't seem to have the retro factor that the old Fokkers and old ATRs and Jetstream 32s have, but nonetheless, they're still a great ride across country. Number 9 is interesting because it's a flight with Jetstar between the Gold Coast and Melbourne on their 787. Now, usually I'm not going to go and put a budget airline on a list of flights that I really have enjoyed. I like full service airlines by and large, and in many circumstances I actually find full service airlines to give you better value. Because by the time you want to pick a seat, because I like having a window view, and by the time you pay extra for baggage and maybe decide you want a bit of food, in many cases, you're actually at the same price as you were for booking a flight with a full service airline. The reason I took this flight was actually just because of the plane. The flight between the Gold Coast and Melbourne was actually an extension of Jetstar service JQ12, which usually runs just from Tokyo to the Gold Coast. However, as a repositioning flight, they'll often operate the aircraft to another destination on the way, so that the airline can use that aircraft for other services. So in this case, I flew Gold Coast to Melbourne with Jetstar on a 787 departing from the international terminal. I do not advise travelling to Victoria and certainly not into Melbourne with the current COVID-19 situation. However, this trip was in November last year and was an interesting way to get there instead of plying down the east coast in A320s and 737s. Getting a wide body on a domestic service, especially a 2-hour flight, is quite special actually. But there's just one thing to keep in mind. Because this flight departs from an international terminal, you will require government-issued photo ID to board, such as a passport, a Australian driver's license, or a 18 plus card, because you actually have to clear immigration as well as security at both ends, because you're flying into and out of the international terminal. And funnily enough, it's probably one of the only ways you'll ever get an Australian stamp on a boarding pass, because they certainly don't put them in passports anymore, which is a shame. I've gone through 9 great flights, and I've got a 10th one that I also really enjoyed. It's another Virgin Australia service, and it's another short hop, and it was an ATR 72 flight with Virgin Australia between Canberra and Sydney. So much like the Newcastle to Sydney flight, it's quite an expensive way to travel a short distance. However, unlike Newcastle to Sydney, there's no obvious easy option to get between the two cities. Newcastle is easy. The train is so cheap. The train is like $9. So why would you go and spend $100 on a flight when the train is $9 and in real term takes just as long? However, with Canberra to Sydney, the choice isn't so obvious. I suppose another logical option to consider is a coach. Coach, I think from memory when I booked and decided to fly instead, was about $50 and takes about 5 hours. The train was not practical as it cost more than the coach and took longer because it had to wind through everything. So I decided on going by air and flying with Virgin Australia. It was a nice flight. And again, the one benefit with those short flights is into Sydney, unfortunately, they're expensive. However, the benefit of flying these short flights into Sydney is you get to fly into the city at a nice low altitude and get great scenic views out the side, which, if you're a town planner and an av geek, is almost priceless, to be fair. So that marks an end of my review of my 10 favourite domestic flights in Australia. And I should point out there's a bunch of cool flights that I've flown within Australia that still don't make it to this list. I should point out that all of those flights I've mentioned, none of them are in particular order, but we all have soft spots for certain flights and certain aircraft types, which are a little bit of a bias as well. I would say at the moment, if you are planning to go and travel and explore, please take precautions, such as ensuring you've got hand sanitizer and considering wearing a mask. Airlines will have their own policies around that. I certainly know if I'm flying or traveling by long distance public transport, I'll be wearing a mask, practicing social distancing, keeping your distance from people, and ensure that you're following the advice of your local authorities when and where you can. And I think the best bit of advice I can give at the moment, or the best thing I can say, is why not use this downtime as an opportunity, as the borders of our states reopen, to go and explore your local state and then enjoy travelling around Australia. And whilst you're doing that, all I can say is please go out and support your regional communities as well. You know, if you've been thinking about that bit of regional travel, just go and do it. I've got a little something in the pipeline that I'm planning to do with a regional Queensland trip as well, which I'm really looking forward to. So once again, I'd say thank you for joining me on Talking Planning and see you again soon.